Hello and welcome. You are watching episode 5 of our second season of Now More Questions, the interview series that gets conversation started on European affairs. Now, in today's episode, we'll be discussing the development of virtual worlds, which is effectively an extension of the dramatic digitalization of our societies, which is happening at a speed that makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for regulation to keep up. And any form of regulation will always seem a little bit outdated compared to the latest developments in digital technologies. And this means that over time, very likely, we will be discovering some harms that we would not be in any position to anticipate or to imagine. Or would we be? Well, to discuss this, I am joined by Petra Bertová. She is a co-organizer of the Stop 5G campaign, which is a citizen initiative, raising awareness precisely on some of the harms of this excessive digitalization in our society. So Petra, thank you for joining and welcome to the show.
Hello, welcome.
So Petra, can you just give us a glimpse to what is the Stop 5G campaign all about?
The Stop 5G campaign took place for 1 year to collect signatures for European Citizens Initiative. We are asking the EU to make regulation that will protect our health, nature, environment, and privacy. Who are we? Europeans for Safe Connections is a coalition of national and international organizations that are aware of adverse consequences of the modern communication technologies. We are not against technology, but we are pro-safe technology and safe connections.
And I imagine that the concept of safe must be hotly debated in this area of digital technology. So hopefully we'll get to understand a little bit more what you mean by safe.
Safe means not wireless, not through the air, but through the cable, the Ethernet cable. It's the safest way we know now.
Okay, so that's already one recommendation for our audience. So thanks for that. And so in the tradition of Now More Questions, we hand over the first question to the previous guest on the show. That was Diego Marin, Policy Officer for Raw Materials and Resource Justice at the European Environmental Bureau. And he was interviewed on the topic of critical raw materials.
So how does 5G would impact work or production relations in the world? And could it lead to a future in which people work less and then we automize things more? Is there a positive societal benefit to automatization? And this ties also to the campaign within the post-growth movement or degrowth world that you can think of, that tries to connect how we can have or move towards a more like a 4-day week or a 3-day week. Could automatization help us in that? And or is this just an illusion? And we are headed for a darker future. I don't know.
Every situation has positives and negatives, pros and cons. And in our Citizens Initiative, we were warning about these cons, about these negatives, because we think that only positives are promoted uncritically. And maybe it will help people in some way to reduce work time, for people to have more leisure time, but it will have very huge impact on discrimination, our freedom. Artificial intelligence, it's not so obvious that it's supporting us. Some are saying that it will do more harm.
one of the arguments then in the Stop 5G campaign is that the development of digital technologies will be and is in fact harmful to health. And when it comes to virtual worlds, the European Commission released a study recently that looks at some of the opportunities and problems with extended reality. And I was curious to see that actually health issues were only really mentioned, I think, twice, and in relation to sickness and dizziness that you might feel when you wear a virtual reality headset. And actually, a lot of the other mentions of health were related more to the way virtual worlds can, in fact, improve healthcare because they allow for doctors and people training to become doctors to anticipate through trial and error actually being in the situation of providing healthcare and therefore improving the actual delivery of healthcare. So I would be really curious to understand from you whether you see this as a gross underestimation of the real health effects of virtual worlds and digitalization, and do you think the risk-benefit ratio is being considered sufficiently in the development of virtual worlds?
I had looked at this study you mentioned, and this study is a very good example how virtual reality and digitalization generally is promoted uncritically. In fact, debates on digitalization are supplanted by advertising. This study you mentioned was nothing but an advertisement. Virtual reality has negatives. Its parts, headsets, smart glasses, earpods, all of them are connected wirelessly to your smartphone or computer. Usual connections are Wi-Fi in 6 gigahertz broadband spectrum, or Wi-Fi in 60 gigahertz broadband spectrum, or Bluetooth. And many devices are sold without an Ethernet port that I showed before. This issue, virtual tablets and notebooks and virtual reality is no exception. This issue raises concerns among people criticizing increasing electrosmog. For example, USB Type-C port is only for power. We strongly suggest that this port could be used for internet connection as well. In advertisement, there is no information about possibility to connect via cable. Some promote as a benefit that there is no cables. Even battery charging is possible without cable. There are thousands of studies showing that radio frequency electromagnetic fields are harmful to living beings. But did you know that no impact analysis was done before the deployment of virtual reality? If you consider the fact that you are effectively strapping that thing over your eyes and ears, it is kind of mind-boggling to think that no detailed studies have been done to accurately find out what implications it might have on our health, this virtual reality.
Yeah, and you talk about this big push with a lot of advertising, and it's true that especially in recent months we've seen a lot of effort being put in the outreach to really citizens and consumers on the value of virtual worlds. I think we've all heard of the metaverse as one example, but we are more and more seeing examples of how the virtual world will become a part, very likely, of our future society. And in particular, something that I've spotted is that it seems to focus a lot on education in particular. And you've mentioned some of the aspects related to the harms for health. But how do you react to the way that virtual worlds are being implemented also as a learning environment for children? So in the development of, child psychology and our relationship to the world, are there worrying health effects there as well?
Yeah, it's the second boring part about it. You said it correctly. It's mostly associated with gaming, and it will remain so because for every educating application someone creates, there will be hundreds gaming applications created. And addiction to screens and video games is already now a public health issue, and it's increasing. Younger and younger children show symptoms including decreased ability to learn, concentrate, to relate to the environment. In 2020, teenagers spend more time in front of screens than teachers. Undoubtedly, an immersive metaverse will lead to even more screen time. In our campaign, we once had a poster about celebrities who limit their children's screen time. So someone is aware. I think that virtual reality, the same as smoking, should be allowed only after 18. Professor Dr. Manfred Spitzer, German neuroscientist and psychiatrist, explains that the use of screens in schools will probably be more harmful than helpful to children. In his two books, Digitale Demenz and Wie das digitalisierte Leben unsere Gesundheit ruiniert, he gives an extensive summary of the many science done in this field. To mention a few important facts, children need real people and the real world for a healthy development. For learning, the brain needs to use the physical experience to the real world. Screens don't give children this experience. They give an artificial two-dimensional or three-dimensional representation of images, and children can only understand them when they already know them from the real world. This is important. The development of neurological patterns in the brain takes place at fixed periods in the child's life. For example, learning a language. You probably know about a feral child, also called wild child or wolf child. When you rescue them in older age, they are unable to learn any language. After specific receptive period, the structures are fixed and changes are no longer possible. Children simply need more contact with real world, a real learning environment, not the virtual learning environment. In real life, you simply don't have 7 lives.
Yeah, humans are not cats, even though in the virtual world they could become cats or be represented as cats or represent themselves as cats, but in reality that's not possible. But what do you say to the people who would argue that technology is around us and actually, children should acquire the skills to master that technology as early as possible because they will be living with that technology? So I understand obviously the threat in the psychological development of the human brain when it comes to the interaction with these virtual worlds and these virtual tools. But if it is going to be a reality, isn't it better to anticipate that reality early on, to learn the codes of these tools as early as possible in order to hopefully dominate the technology as opposed to be dominated by the technology?
Our organization, we are calling for awareness and precaution, and also we want to put a stop to a massive unregulated digitalization. There's an old East Europe wisdom. Fire is a good slave, but a bad master. Let's not digitalize everything before analyzing impact. Let not the technology be our master, but make it our slave. As I said before, children already use technology more than adults, than their teachers. It's easily to be learned, but it's very difficult to be learned to use wisely and with precaution. You cannot give a child a knife. You first have to learn him how to use knife safely.
And in this development, this is actually a very tricky part because the technology is moving at a pace where it's very difficult to understand how to use it safely, but also even more difficult is to transmit the knowledge of how to use it safely when it's difficult to have the knowledge in the first place. So there is a speed here that is very difficult. And I understand what you're saying is we need to have a lot more impact assessment before we move on with this giant push towards digitalization. But at the same time, it's such a massive political priority. There are so many vested interests, corporate interests, investing a lot of money into this technology. So it does seem to be a bit of an idealistic scenario to imagine that we would be able to put a stop to this digitalization before we have a proper impact assessment. So although you say this, do you also have some real alternative plans to say, yes, it's possible and we can do it in this way, and in the meantime, let's just put a stop to all of this? Is that the kind of thing that you're asking for?
We understand it's very difficult, but we ask people to be more human. To European laws, there are laws about precautionary principle. We already have the knowledge base. We have everything in our laws, but we just don't do the laws. For example, the precautionary principle is anchored in EU law and in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, TFEU, and confirmed by many court cases. What does it mean? We all are happy that new medicines are a subject to the precautionary principle. We saw it during Corona. Only after many tests, EMA approves vaccines. In my opinion, new technological developments are also a subject to the precautionary principle. Don't you think so? But it is not. As I mentioned at the beginning, there is no impact analysis on health, on the environment, neither on our privacy. Virtual reality involves diverse biometric inputs: position, speed, expression and emotion, heart rate, brain waves, behavior, first-person perspective. So users' data privacy is at high risk. Metaverses will only increase the amount of sensitivity of data. Despite EU's strong regulatory framework, which already exists, it hasn't been able to protect us from the harms that the current two-dimensional world do to democracy, mental health, public safety, and national security. And how about three-dimensional immersive virtual worlds to be rolled out and deployed at mass scale? Only if, after extensive impact analysis and using the precautionary principle, we decide it is safe enough to allow virtual worlds to be deployed, at first for testing purposes. Only then we could allow it to selected groups and then to wider public. The only responsible approach to virtual worlds is to use the precautionary principle. This do no harm principle states that we must pause and review before leaping into new innovations that may prove irreversibly disastrous for humanity.
So you're depicting a future where the digital technology might be seriously affecting human health and psychological development. So we will need to see what the long-term effects are of all of this, and hopefully there will be a monitoring
Sorry, no,
of
we
these
don't have
effects.
to see. Sorry, we don't do it and then see what does it. We have to first test it and then put it to wider public. This is done in everything else, in medicine, in the other types of technology, but not this one. Why this one is an exemption?
And this one, as I understand it, is probably not even monitored. I mean, we know that it hasn't gone through a proper health approval system, but are the health effects even being monitored by public policy? I don't think so.
You are right.
So there's already a lot of work to be done in pushing awareness raising into the actual political debate, I think. So hopefully that's something you can contribute to. The other element of this debate is also how are users being protected versus technology providers, because I think it's particularly strong in this phenomenon of digital technology is that there's a massive contrast between users who are inherently very vulnerable. We don't really understand the technology that allows us to actually communicate in the way we do, and we're not really aware of the kind of information we are sharing, whereas the technology providers obviously have a lot more foresight into the way the technology will be developed, into the way it will be used. And so there is a real imbalance between technology providers and users. And we've seen some big societal clashes in certain parts of the economy where big digital platforms come in and completely change the, for instance, work relationship, or the offer and demand in specific sectors in a way that is very challenging to the status quo. So to some extent, you can say there's a revolutionary aspect, which can be good. Revolutions can bring about good change. At the same time, revolutions can also be very bad. Revolutions can also bring about very bad change. Okay, it's just a question of judgment and values that you wish to support. So in this period of massive revolution, do you think that our democracies, that in principle are there to protect our interests, or defend our interests at least, do you think that democracies are doing enough in comparison to what technology providers are developing, and in particular how this is linking up to democratic life as such, because we see more and more democratic life being carried out through digital means?
European states are not protecting users from any lobbyists, not only from technology providers. In fact, in Europe, there has evolved the system legalizing corruption by calling it lobbyism. So European states are not protecting its citizens. In many situations, owning a mobile phone is mandatory to have an access or a service. I call it discrimination rather than modern democratical tool. In other situations, we demand barrier-free access, but do not demand mobile phone-free access. And there are people sensitive to radio frequency radiation. How can democracy be defended for this minority that has trouble to make itself heard because of the endless radiation? They cannot live an ordinary life. They can't take part in demonstrations, public hearings. Okay. Answer to the part of question if we are too dependent. The Western way of life is dependent on competition. Maybe you are familiar with the scientific term, the tragedy of the commons. This metaphor illustrates that unrestricted access to common resources ultimately reduces the resources through overexploitation. This occurs because individuals want to maximize their benefits, which is a logical thing to do, while the costs of the exploitation are borne by all. In other words, profit is private, costs are public.
And in fact, profit is built largely on the fact that you're not that you are in fact externalizing these costs, whether they are human, societal, environmental, or other. A lot of these costs are not internalized to a profitable activity, and that's definitely part of the business model. And here in this scenario, there are some very clear corporate interests, and it will be interesting to see how democracies will be able to position themselves in relation to those very specific corporate interests that hold a lot of power over digital technology. And maybe actually what's interesting here also in a more geopolitical sense is that I think where there has been quite a lot of echo in relation to something that could be considered a stop 5G campaign is not so much on the technology itself, but on where the technology is coming from. So if you are in Europe and you perceive that 5G and all of this technology is coming from China, apparently you need to be worried. Whereas if it's coming from the United States, apparently this is fine. Is that something you've seen in your Stop 5G campaign, that you get support because people, consider that it's a Chinese initiative and this will be dangerous for European democracy? Is that something that you've seen?
At first, we are strictly unpolitical organization. So I will not tell you about China or any other country in the world, but what we are talking is, and you said it correctly, we need more as impact assessment. We don't have it. Or if we have it, it's saying, it's warning us and we don't listen to. So you are very right. We need more assessments, more precaution, more education. And it doesn't matter what republic, what state, what country does the technology come from.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Petra, for sharing your views. I think, the European Commission will be working on an initiative on virtual worlds, non-legislative this year. It's expected for the second quarter of the year. I think if you have one recommendation to the European Commission, am I correct in saying that it would be to carry out a very thorough, robust, long-term impact assessment on the deployment of digital technologies? Would that be your key recommendation today to the European Commission?
Yes, they already have a lot of material. They have the department STOA, STOA. They have a lot of analyses, but they ignore them. So we call for precautionary principle, yes, and for more impact analysis, because in general, just maybe you were wondering why I'm saying we have a lot of studies and then I say we don't have any assessment. To put it correctly, we have a lot of studies showing generally about radio frequency, electromagnetic fields, and about specific frequencies and such, but none regarding just virtual worlds and the usage of virtual worlds or 5G. No impact analysis about 5G and its impacts on environment. So we just want to put that correctly.
Yeah, as I understand it, what you're saying is that the digital technology that is land-based or home-based can be manageable, but the moment you make that wireless and portable, it starts to create a a world of radiomagnetic fields that we need to do a lot more assessment of, because these are interacting with our general mobility, our general development in a way that is not specific to what goes through a cable and enters into a very specific device. And I think that maybe for people listening, for our audience, this is something to maybe consider and think about. The way we connect the digital world and digital technology. Maybe it shouldn't be so much on the move. So these are questions that you've posed, Petra. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and for sharing your insights.
Thank you very much.
Well, that was Petra Bertová, co-organizer of the Stop 5G campaign. She gave us quite a radical and different view on digital technologies. She called upon the European Commission to use of its precautionary principle enshrined in the Treaty of the functioning of the European Union. Why is this not being applied to digital technologies? Well, probably because we are so amazed and thrilled by so many of the developments that digitalization has enabled. But clearly there are maybe a couple of hidden harms that we haven't fully assessed, or not assessed enough, or not assessed at all. So maybe you will now be watching these interviews using your cable and no longer Wi-Fi. Maybe it's better to try and go back to something more physical and less virtual. Maybe that's actually something we should start discussing and debating, as opposed to just steamrolling ahead with blind digitalization. Maybe you have other views. So let us know in the comments, and thanks for watching. And hopefully you'll be here for our next episode that will be looking at defense of democracy. Thank you for watching, and bye-bye.